Another big thing is know the job that you're attempting to apply for. One of the biggest faux pas, if you would, in the application process is applying for a job and writing down anything available. That automatically is a killer. Target, be specific, go after what interests you or what you're qualified for. Anything available may and likely will suggest a defeatist behavior. That means that you don't believe that you've got the self-confidence to do one thing and one thing great. You're just basically throwing darts up against the wall hoping that one of them will stick. That doesn't impress an employer. You need, and again, this goes back to homework. You need to be prepared to know what you can do within that organization that's going to make them better the day after you're hired than the day before. That's your mental attitude. Understand what the job is all about, the essential functions. And remember, we talked about those a couple of seconds ago, and the essential competencies of the job. Look through that job description, and most employers will gladly give you a copy of what the expectations of a job is. And it's very important as a part of your homework assignment to go home and look at how you would be best able to accommodate that, that position's essential responsibilities and essential job functions, and be able to talk about it when you go in for a job interview. As I said, ask for a copy of the job description. Ask what experience, qualifications, or certifications and special skills or training is needed for the position. If you can, talk with someone who has been in that position before or someone who's worked for the organization. Ask questions about the job. And remember, you're selling yourself. You can't just go in and expect someone to give you a job. You have to sell yourself, and you have to make that employer understand that you are the most qualified, capable candidate, regardless of what your disability or lack thereof is. It's that simple. Highlight your experiences that relate to the job, and make sure you have evidence of all required certifications and licensures. So, just in a nutshell, you have homework to do when you have to look at applying for a job. You have to look at what those essential functions are, what the competencies are. You have to look within yourself as to what you possess. And then you have to make a merger. And you have to be able to understand and feel confident, self-esteem is involved here, as to what you can offer that employer that's going to complement those essential job functions. Make sense? Okay. And when you go into a job interview, you have to feel so good about you. If there is an impediment in the application process, this is where you ask for an accommodation. After you've done your homework, after you've looked at what the essential job functions are and the essential competencies, after you've looked within yourself and you know what you can do, if there are one or more things that you believe may compromise your ability to do one or more of those essential job functions, or those things that might not be essential on a position description, this is where you have to identify if there is an impediment in the application process and be willing to ask for an accommodation. This is an opportunity where you can really shine. This is not something where you need to be challenging. This is a process where you need to be very polite, let the employer understand the impediment, but there's no need for you to become angry or basically for you to become overly challenging. This is where you've done your homework, you've looked at where you believe you're going to need some help. The help is going to allow you to basically level the playing field. And if it can be reasonably accommodated, this is where that part of the process, of the application process, comes out. Have something in mind as an accommodation, but be open to a discussion of alternatives. This is where the homework, again, going back to the homework process, when you're looking at those essential job functions, if you will, of a position, and you're looking at, if you would, what you bring to the table, you may figure out that there's one or more things that you might need some help with. You need to be prepared when you're going into a job interview to be able to sit down with that employer and tell them exactly what it is you need to have as a consideration. And be able to share with them what you believe would be a reasonable accommodation. I'm just going to stop there for a couple of seconds, but does that make sense? You know what you might not be able to do at 100% efficiency, but at the same time, you have got an idea as to what would be a possible reasonable accommodation. It could be something this simple. You may know, because of diabetes, that you're going to have to be out of work more likely than not on certain times or on certain days. A reasonable accommodation could be altering your work schedule. Something that simple. The employer would go, hey, not a big deal. That's not going to be an undue hardship on us. But you would need to be already thinking about that before you go into the job interview. Make sense? Okay. There is no obligation to disclose the existence or severity of any impairment. I don't care whether you are in a wheelchair or whether you have any other type of a device that may imply a disability. There is no reason, there is no expectation on your part to disclose any type of disability. Now, very quickly, the employer can ask about your ability to do certain essential functions or competencies of the job, okay? But unless you want to discuss your disability, that should not come out in the interview, okay? You may be asked to demonstrate the ability to perform essential functions and competencies of the job, so it's important to know the essential elements beforehand and also know what may be reasonably accommodated. And this can be done by you sitting down and basically do some soul searching during your homework process. Keep any and all physician-ordered limitations regarding what you're able to do. Keep those in mind during your job search. One of the things that is extremely important, don't feel compelled to withhold information that you feel like is important in the employer's search for a qualified applicant. As I say here at the very bottom, be open and very honest. If you go into a job search or the application process and you withhold information, this may place your potential employer in a difficult position. If you apply for a job that your physician says that you cannot or should not perform, or one in which you know that you might not have the abilities to perform it. And if you do get the job, that could be another issue once you become an employee, because you may have withheld information, and that's not good during the employment process as well. That could cause you to have some corrective actions right at the very beginning of your job, and that's not a good thing. If you feel like there are one or more things that would cause you to need to be accommodated, then that's where you talk about it with the employer at that point in time. Everybody understand? Okay. Many job offers are conditional upon successful completion of a pre-employment post-offer onboarding expectations. Here basically is what this is. Many times, and I'll use Georgetown Hospital System as an example, there are certain onboarding expectations we have for any applicant and employee before they become functional on the job. And usually these occur right before they begin work or during their first few days, if you would, of employment. Examples that we have are drug and alcohol testing, physical agility testing, and I'll talk about that in a second, background checks. These are things that we look at as prerequisites for our employees, future employees, to be able to master. Obviously, drug and alcohol testing speaks for itself. There is no reasonable accommodation for you coming in being intoxicated okay, during a job interview or as an employee. I'm sorry, that speaks for itself. Physical agility testing is something that we started doing a few years ago, and essentially what our premise is that it takes certain strength, agility, dexterity to do certain jobs. And when you come in, you go through a PAT test, physical agility test, that will allow us to match you with the most appropriate job to ensure that we're not compromising your well-being, okay? Background checks insofar as any type of criminal activity. Obviously, these are onboarding things that most employers, if not all, do. If you go through some type of a onboarding process and if you are rejected, politely ask why and if you can address the employer's concern. More likely than not, it might have something to do with physical expectations, and if there is a way for you to look and seek a reasonable accommodation, this is the time where that needs to be done. And that's why you need to have already done your homework and be able to sit down and very objectively, if you would, talk with the employer about that. We've all been rejected in favor of a more qualified candidate, but don't give up. And this is the most important thing. Having the assurance that you've got the qualifications, having the assurance that with some reasonable accommodation you can master a job, having that as an arsenal when you go in and you're looking for employment is extremely, extremely important. So you got the job, now what do we do? So this is exciting. You've done your homework. You were a tremendous applicant during the application process. You talked about things that may needed to be accommodated. The employer recognized that your talents were so far superior to others and that the accommodations could be easily done. You got the job. The key thing, and I could stop my discussion right now if I could only say 3 more words. Performance is everything. Once you get your foot across the threshold, it's what you do on the job, okay? I had an employer many, many years ago when I first was getting started in the industry, and he said anybody can dance for 30 or 40 minutes. That means anybody can look good during an interview that lasts 30 or 40 minutes. He said the marathon is where the rubber hits the road, and that's what you do once you get the job and how you impress your employer, how you impress the people that you're there to serve, if you will. Understand the job and what is expected. Keep up with changes and, if available, explore the employer's continuing education programs. Georgetown Hospital System is, I think, a great example of that in terms of our continuing education opportunities. Remember, good jobs are competitive, and there will always, and don't forget this, always someone willing to take your place if you compromise your opportunity. If you compromise the opportunity that you've got, that you worked so hard for during that employment application process, there's always going to be somebody standing in the hall very willing to take your place. And especially when you're looking at the state of our economy now. We're running double-digit inflation, or not inflation, but rather unemployment in the state of South Carolina. I think nationwide we're probably back up to about 9%. I think in South Carolina it's probably closer to 11.5%. So trust me, if you find a good opportunity, then performance is everything. Don't compromise it just because you feel like you can rest on your laurels. No, this is when the fun starts. You thought the fun was starting to get the job. The fun does not start until after you've secured the job and you are expected to perform. If and when there are impediments which interfere with performing your best, be upfront and discuss this with your supervisor. Don't be embarrassed and hide it. This is not going to be to your advantage or to the employer's advantage. You need to be able to discuss the problem openly. Let your employer know if an accommodation is necessary. Be forthcoming. And as I mentioned earlier, if you have an idea what accommodation might work, be open for those ideas and maybe even other ideas from your employer. This is so important for you to be able to be upfront and very candid with your employer. Ideas for consideration, leave of absence, continuous and intermittent FMLA, job restructuring, reasonable accommodation, equipment changes and additions, reasonable accommodation. These are examples of what you can have at your disposal, if you would, once you become an employee of an organization. A leave of absence is Family Medical Leave Act. This allows employees that come under, or employers rather, that come under FMLA to grant you 12 weeks of either intermittent or continuous FMLA. This is very important if you have a disability and that disability flares up and you need to take time off from work. This law has been in place probably since the 90s as well, and we deal with it every single day at Georgetown Hospital System, and we have quite a few employees who take advantage of it, and rightly so. Job restructuring is an example of a reasonable accommodation. Equipment changes or additions. It could be something as remedial as removing steps and putting in a small ramp. I mean, that is a reasonable accommodation. That should not be an undue hardship, if you would, on an employer. But the key thing to remember is your ability to perform the essential functions and competencies of the job. That is where the rubber hits the road. And at the end of the day, if you can do the essential functions and the essential competencies of the job with reasonable accommodation, then basically at the end of the day, you've nailed it.